Our gospel lesson this morning is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. It is still Easter Sunday. The day continues in this reading as we continue to celebrate Easter. The women have been to the tomb and have come back and have shared their story with the men. And two of the men have headed home. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive." Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women said, but they did not see him. Then Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were open, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord is risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then these two told what had happened on the road, how he had been known to them in the breaking of the bread. If there is a theme that runs through all of the resurrection stories, it is the theme of foolishness. Last night it was an idle's tale. Today Jesus asked them if they were foolish because they didn't understand all of the things that he had taught them over time. And I wonder, as I wondered last week, how often we are foolish and don't understand and don't recognize, like Mary in the garden who did not recognize Jesus and thought he was the gardener. Like Peter and John who saw the empty tomb and didn't know what to make of it. Like Cleopas and his friend who, walking down the road, had Jesus come up and join them, and he didn't know who he was. Do we recognize Christ when we see him today? Do we recognize Christ in the stranger that comes across our life and our path? Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm in a conversation with a friend, and someone who I don't know all of a sudden joins my conversation, I'm not really a happy camper. I've been known to do that, just throw something out, and see if it sticks. And usually when I'm in that kind of a conversation, someone over here tries to join it, you know how you kind of turn your back towards them to try and shut them off? Well, these two didn't do that. Instead, they stopped. They stopped and let Jesus join them in their walk and in their journey. And as they walked, have you ever been in one of those conversations where a stranger joins and then for the rest of the conversation they dominate it? This is exactly what happened here. Jesus joins their conversation and he spends the next 5, 6, 7, 4, 3, 2 miles, however many miles it was from that 7-mile trip they had left, and tells them about Moses and tells them about all the prophets. And if you think I get long-winded sometime, that must have been quite the sermon. The Sermon on the Road. And they let him join the conversation. And they let him dominate the conversation. But even with all of that, they did not recognize him for who he was. When they got to their town, to Emmaus, and they got to their home, Jesus walked on ahead. He knew what an important value hospitality was. Who knows, he could have started his story with Abraham and Sarah and how they welcomed the strangers into their home. He could have talked about those other occasions when Jesus welcomed the stranger at the well, when he welcomed the stranger, the demoniac in Gerasene. All of the times that strangers were given hospitality, because hospitality was the way of life in the Middle East. So he doesn't want to put them out. He just walks on ahead, but they say, wait, friend. It's late. It's getting dark. Night's almost here. Why don't you join with us in our meal? And Jesus goes with them. Now, can you imagine the audacity of this move? The audacity of this move. Jesus is a stranger, a guest in this house, and he reaches out and takes the bread and breaks it and blesses it and gives it to them. Should it not have been the other way around? Shouldn't the hosts have taken the bread and broke it and given it to Jesus? But Jesus takes the role of being the witness, just as he took the role of being the witness for the woman at the well. And he takes the bread and he blesses it and he breaks it. And suddenly it's almost like they got a new prescription. And they could see, they could recognize who Jesus was. And just like that woman at the well who was so excited, she ran to tell her friends, these two disciples run all the way back to Jerusalem. That's 7 miles. They find their friends and they tell them the story of how Jesus, the risen Christ, was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Alfred Burt is one of my favorite carol writers. He was a trumpet player in the middle of the 19th century and, 20th century. His dad, Bert Bates, say that 3 times, 5 times. Bert Bates used to write poems for their Christmas cards. And the family cards and all their friends looked forward to receiving those cards. And as Alfred became a more talented musician, he started to write Christmas carols to go with the poems that his father had written. And then some other things that they found. One of the carols that you might remember is Caroling, Caroling, Now We Go, Christmas bells are ringing, caroling, caroling through the snow. Hark we now. I forgot the rest of it. One of my favorites of his could just as well have been for Easter. It is not an original poem for them, but rather was an old Scottish prayer, an old Scottish rune, much like the Lord bless and keep you that I use, the Lord may the road rise to meet you that I use at the end of services. It went something like this. I met a stranger yesterday evening. I put food in the eating place, drink in the drinking place, music in the music place. And he blessed my house and my wife, my cattle, and my loved ones. Often, often, often goes the Christ in the stranger's guise. Often, often, often goes the Christ in the stranger's disguise. Are our eyes open to the strangers in our lives who can become Christ for us, or that we can become Christ for them? There is no better preacher. There was no better preacher in the 20th century, as far as I'm concerned, than Fred Craddock, the great disciple preacher. Time magazine said he was one of the 5 finest preachers in America. He died a couple years ago, and we bless his memory. One of the first General Assemblies that I attended, the gathering of all of our churches, Fred was the preacher, and he told this story. He had been invited to go to Winnipeg, that's Canada. You got to remember, Fred's a Southern boy, bred, raised a Tennessean. He didn't like winter much. He was invited to go to Winnipeg, but the people that invited him assured him that it'd be okay because it was in the middle of October. So Fred agrees to go, and he goes up, and they have the Friday night where he does a lecture, and then he's going to come back on Saturday morning. But as they're leaving after the Friday night lecture, there's a little snow in the air. By the time they wake up on Saturday morning, 3 feet of snow had fallen in middle of October in Winnipeg, Canada. And the guy calls Fred and says, Fred, none of us expected this. I'm sorry I can't come and get you and take the breakfast. We've canceled your speech this morning, and the airport's closed. However, if you can get out and walk down the street and down the block and around the corner, there's a bus depot, and there's a cafe in that bus depot. So Fred gets out his light windbreaker, which was all they said he would need. And if you know Fred, he always wore a cap, and so he got out his cap. And even in his room, it wasn't enough to help much. So Fred goes into the bathroom there in his hotel room, and he gets the toilet paper roll, and he starts pulling toilet paper. And when he's pulled enough, he takes the toilet paper, and he makes a little nest inside his hat, thinking that it might help keep the wind off. So Fred gets out, and he walks down the street, and he finds this little bus depot, and there's a small cafe, and as you can imagine, it's packed. It is packed. Every person traveling in Western Canada was in that bus depot that morning. So after waiting for a while, he finally gets a seat at the counter, and after waiting for a while, the cook, waiter, dish boy, all the same person, comes over and says, "What can I get you?" And Fred says, "Well, could I look at the menu?" He says, "Well, what do you want to look at the menu for?" And all we have is soup. So Fred says, "Well, what kind of soup?" "We have soup." "What do you mean, what kind of soup? We have soup. Do you want the soup or don't you want the soup?" So Fred orders the soup. After a while, the soup comes, and he looks at the soup, and he smells the soup, and it doesn't smell any better than looks. It's kind of this gray thing, and he dips his spoon in it, and he puts it in it. He almost didn't get it in his mouth, and he stopped after one spoonful. But the bowl was kind of warm, and it was kind of cold, so you know how you do with a cup of coffee? You warm your hands up on it. Fred was warming his hands up on that bowl of soup. When the door to the cafe opens up and a big wind blows in, and in comes a woman in a small jacket and sits a couple seats away from him at the counter. After she waits for a while, the guy in the greasy apron comes over and says, "What can I get you?" She says, "Could I have a glass of water, please?" So he goes and gets a glass of water and comes back. "Now, what would you like to order?" She says, I would just like a glass of water. And he says, "You can't just have a glass of water. You have to order something. There are people waiting to take that seat." And she says, "Sir, I just want a glass of water. I have paying customers here, and you will have to go if you don't order anything." So she gets up to leave. And as if at one, everybody in the restaurant got up and started heading to the door. And Fred thought to himself, "I don't know what's happening, but they're voting and I'm voting with them." And the owner says, "All right, sit down." And he brought her some soup. So Fred asked the guy next to him if he knew who this woman was, and he didn't know who she was. And they ate, and pretty soon he started to hear other people eating their soup. So Fred looked down and he says, "It doesn't look so bad." And he takes a little and he tastes it, and he says, "It's not bad," and he eats his soup. And he says, "I can't really tell you what it tastes like, but it tasted a little bit like bread and wine. Just a little bit like bread and wine." Amen. Our hymn of discipleship this morning is "Were You there? I was there to hear your mourning cry." It's God's reminder to us that at any point and every point in our lives that God is with us if our eyes are open and we can see God in the stranger who is in our lives. I was there to hear your mourning cry, number 75. Will you stand as we sing?